No right that you fought for can ever be assumed to stay with you for the rest of your life. You have to protect the rights that you've won.
If I'm going to die, I want to know what it is like to be free.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cheryl Crooks. I'm Executive Director of Cascadia International Women's Film Festival, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final live interview of our 4-day online festival. This evening, we're going to be speaking with director Courtney Quirin, whose film Guardian is an environmental documentary feature, and she'll be talking with Rachel Vosick, who is the Executive Director for the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association here in Bellingham. Her subject chronicles a program in Canada that is being discontinued, and it's one that I think most of you will find very fascinating, not to mention the fact that the scenery is breathtaking. But before we get to that interview, I would like first to thank all of the sponsors who have made this 4-day film festival possible. In particular, KCTS and Crosscut Magazine, City of Bellingham, Whatcom County, People's Bank, the Mary Redmond Foundation, Veritas Media, Intellatonics, Mount Baker Experience, and the Washington Arts Commission, as well as all of our Centennial Circle donors and our other donors and film sponsors. To all of you, thank you so much, because without your support, this would not have been possible. So before we get into the conversation, let's have a look at the trailer.
This is the real world out here. Where you come from, that's not the real world. This is it. This is where it all comes from. This is where it all starts. You know? You can't build your cities without this out here.
Numbers been looking for what you're looking for?
Terrible. Probably some of the worst returns we've ever seen in this area.
Wow. What a screwed up year this is, holy moly.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, no doubt about that. And you gotta wonder about what's coming.
Pretty desolate place if we didn't have salmon. Bears, wolves, birds, eagles. There isn't an animal in the bush around here that doesn't somehow relate back to salmon.
a big part of my life, actually. This is walking streams and counting fish. Now it's kind of over, I guess. That was actually quite a big hill there at one point. They just cut the top right off it.
The government of Canada is really not interested in the wild fishery at all. It's probably more of a pain in the ass for them than anything.
There's a good sign. Gold zero, no harm, no leaks.
I mean, it stops a lot of development, really.
Hi there, my name is Rachel. I work for the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association in Northwest Washington State. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to educate, to inspire, and to engage our community in the process of salmon recovery. We want to see wild salmon thrive in our area into the future. So you can imagine I was really excited to be able to see this film, and also really excited to be able to interview Courtney to learn a little bit more about the details of her experience producing, filming, and creating The Guardians. So Courtney, I'm curious if you can give us a little bit of background. How did you first learn about this program, these incredible people, and what inspired you to want to tell their story?
Sure, yeah. So first, just a little bit of background about myself. I used to be a wildlife biologist. I got a master's in wildlife management, and then I went on to do a PhD. And I did 2 years of a PhD before realizing it wasn't quite the right fit. Like I love science, but I didn't want to tell the stories of science through stats. I wanted to I couldn't really be creative that way. So I went into journalism and film. And then I went back to graduate school for documentary film. And I was covering, as a journalist before that, science and environmental issues. So still very, very in love with wildlife and the environment. And so while I was making my graduate thesis film, I went to UC Berkeley's graduate school of journalism. I made my graduate thesis film was about the decline of small-scale commercial fishing, and I followed a father-son salmon fishing trip out of Vancouver, BC. And my main character was this young fisherman who's 26 at the time, and he told me about the Guardians because he grew up fishing with his dad every summer in the wilderness in the Great Bear Rainforest. And so he said to me, if you really want to know what's going on with the salmon, with the environment in BC, you got to talk to the Guardians. So then he tracked down one of the Guardians' satellite phone numbers because there's no cell service out there. They just have satellite phones. And he called him up and he said, hey, can this filmmaker talk to you? And I cannot remember if he first talked to Doug or Stan. I think it was Stan. And so I then just called up Stan and started talking to him. And at that point, it was the first semester of my second year. And though I was still making my thesis film, I knew that I wanted to already work on my next film idea while I was in graduate school. So in the spring, I took a writing class with Michael Pollan, who's a very accomplished science and environmental and food writer. And in order to get into that class, you had to pitch a story. So before the spring semester, I started talking to Doug and Stan a lot. And as they were telling me about what was going on in the Great Bear Rainforest, and not just about salmon, but just larger cutbacks to science, it reminded me of the year before I was working as a science writer, and I would interview scientists all over the world and write little stories about their research. And I had interviewed a scientist in Canada, and this was in 2013. And he told me about how federal scientists in Canada were essentially being muzzled. They weren't allowed to talk to the press. There were these massive protests all over Canada about science essentially being censored. And in America, I just thought, wow, how come I haven't read about this in the news? It just really wasn't covered at all. So these conversations I had with Doug and Stan reminded me of the previous conversations. And I thought, okay, like, they aren't just fascinating people who have dedicated their lives to caring for salmon, and just living in the wilderness for 40 years is incredible. But the story of the Guardians, the story of the decline of their positions, really told a greater story about the decline of science and environmental management in Canada. So that's how I found out about them.
Right. What a fascinating story. So I've been to and through the Great Bear Rainforest on a couple of trips myself. I know that it's a really remote area. How did you wrap your brain around preparing to do this? Can you just kind of give us a little bit of the logistics of how you got there and where you lived, where you slept, what you ate, how you traveled around while you were doing this for 2 months, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was like super naive when I went and did this. I finished grad school. I had like a summer reporting gig in Johannesburg. And then I came back. I was back for like a week and a half. I stayed at a friend's place because I had just given up my apartment. I bought my camera gear. I brought like always a backup of things. So I had 2 backup drives. But what I learned is, 1 backup is not enough. You need 2 backups, because when I was on their boats and I was going to be in the remote wilderness for a while, my computer crashed as I was transferring some footage. And so that corrupted one drive. And I was like, oh my gosh, now I just have 1 drive. It was scary because you don't want to shoot a whole film and then lose it all. So, okay, back to preparing, how I got there. So I coordinated a lot of this with Stan's wife. She's not in the film, but she was just huge. She kind of arranged everything. She set it up with Doug. So I flew up to Prince Rupert, which is just about on the border with BC and Alaska. And as one person I met in Prince Rupert called it, he's like, we're pretty much at the end of the road here. So there's not much else around. So then Doug met me up in Prince Rupert, and they don't go to town very often at all. Like every few months they go to load up on groceries and things. So I then stayed with Doug and Carol for 2.5 weeks, something like that, a while. And then we met Stan in the middle of nowhere in the Great Bear Rainforest, and I hopped onto his boat. So Doug and Stan are best friends. They talk on the radio quite a bit, on the satellite phone, but they actually don't get to see each other very often. But it was easy enough for them to coordinate to meet. And then I spent about a week with Stan. And then Stan, we had to drive. Prince Rupert's pretty far from where we were, like a day of driving at least. So then Stan drove his boat back to, he took me to Kitimat, and that's where we covered what was going on with the natural gas plants that are being built there. And then that was like my last time with Stan. And then I took 2 different buses to get back to Prince Rupert. And then I stayed in BC for about another month. And I was up in Prince Rupert for 2 weeks, and then went back down deep into the wilderness. I took a 15-hour ferry ride, and I stayed in the fishing cabin of my main character from my thesis film. He said I could stay in his fishing cabin for a week. He wasn't even there for most of it. There wasn't even a key. It was on this island where only 60 people live. You could hear wolves at night. And so I stayed there for a week, and I visited. There are a few First Nations villages around there, and I wanted to find out what was going on with, like, what else was going on in the Great Bear Rainforest with salmon. What else were people doing to make sure that I was getting the right story, or to actually plant the seeds for future stories as well? Because as I got up there, I learned, there are so many stories in the Great Bear Rainforest. Like some of the First Nations communities up there have their own Guardian Watchman programs that are similar, but definitely different from the federal guardian programs. Their data at that time was not incorporated into the federal system, so I just focused on federal rollbacks of environmental legislation. But so I learned a whole lot, traveled around. I stayed with people I met along the way. It was pretty amazing. I think the whole 2 months I stayed in a hotel, maybe 4 days total. When I was up in Prince Rupert, a friend of Stan's, one of the characters, put me in touch with her distant relative. We talked on the phone, and then he was like, stay with me. And I stayed with him for 2 weeks, and he was just like giving me his truck. And then that kept happening. I would go places and people were like, oh, cool, stay with me. I even went from deep in the Great Bear Rainforest. I then went to Vancouver Island because I also wanted to interview retired guardians. I ended up not having those interviews in the film, more for the style of the film that I was telling. But I interviewed retired guardians as well. And one of them lived on an island just off of Vancouver Island where only 100 people live. And so when I went there, and before I went there, I was on a bush plane deep in the Great Bear Rainforest, and I was getting some aerial footage, and I started talking to the pilot, and I told him where I was going next, to this island, and he's like, I've got great friends who live on that island. You'll love them. They'll show you around. So I just went to that island, got in touch with his friends, and then his friends were like, stay with us. And so that just kept happening. I would meet people along the way in these remote areas, and they just took me in. They gave me their car. They fed me. It was truly amazing, the kindness of people. It just blew me away. Like, I don't think I could have gotten this film without the kindness of people.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for sharing. And what about lessons learned? I'm sure you learned so much in this process. If you were to do it over again, what's the advice you would give yourself?
Yeah, okay. So I made this film all by myself, which I don't recommend doing. That's really hard. I didn't have any money. I knew that the Guardians might lose their jobs, and I felt like I gotta go shoot this. Like, if I just wait for funding, it might not come. I might miss the story. They might lose their jobs. So I just went up there with like $2,000 and some gear. And that was hard. If I were to do this again, I would have found a producer from the beginning. It's hard to build a team after the fact, after I've shot and gone so deep into it. So I think that is one thing I would have done differently. But I would have liked to go back and follow up on some of those other stories that I found in the Great Bear Rainforest, but I just didn't really have the bandwidth or funding to do it. But there's still time.
Right. Thank you. So, of course, given the work that I do, I'm really curious about lessons learned. And there are certainly some similarities. There's also some really significant differences between where we're at and the work we do and the work you did. But the common thread that binds us is salmon and salmon recovery. What do you think are sort of lessons learned, or, you know, if the Guardians had advice for folks like our organization who do salmon recovery in Washington State or the Pacific Northwest, what do you think is something that we can learn from your film, from the Guardians, from their work, and, you know, decades of insight working directly with salmon?
Yeah. So some of the biggest takeaways, and I also say this as a former biologist, is consistency in data collection. So like monitoring a stream once is not enough. Stan talks about this in the film, how he tries to go back at least 3 times. That's a ton of work, especially for all the streams that he covers. But really, you need frequent monitoring to capture everything that's happening throughout a season. And just visiting once, like, it might be too early, it might be really late, you may have missed the action. Another thing that Doug talks about is that having the same people do these counts is really important too, because then there's consistency in the counts. Because in the film, you see that like Doug goes deep into the forest and there's just this pool filled with salmon. And it's truly incredible how they can just looking at them tell the differences in species. And they're doing it so quickly, counting on these little tallywhackers. So just these circular things like keep count of fish. And if you don't have a lot of experience, I think it would be very easy to just get it very wrong. And Stan actually has trained some of the First Nations groups that have their the communities that have their own guardian watchman groups. Stan has worked with them and taken people out to train them. And, you know, it does take a while to really get the hang of it. But if you have people coming in and out, like no consistency, 1 year it's this person, 1 year it's that person, their counts might be just different. And then that could throw the data way off. But if you have the same person, even if their counts aren't like 100%, because nobody can do an actual census of wild animals. It's just everything's like an estimate. But having that consistency in the kind of estimates is what is really needed. And this is important because I think there are a lot of citizen science programs out there, which are great. I think getting people out and caring and monitoring is really key. But in order for that data to be meaningful, it needs to be consistent. It needs to be at the same scale as other data collected so that they can be combined, you know? Like if you collect data on a very small scale, like every 100 meters counting something versus on a large scale, every 1,000 meters, those data sets don't go together. You can't collaborate. So I think that looking ahead, coordinating different science programs and monitoring systems is really key in order to get the most out of all the work that people are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good points. Thanks for the advice and the insight. Here's another question from the audience. And this is one that I thought about as well. So in many of the scenes, you're trailing one of the guardians as they're paddling upriver to the survey sites. How did you do that? Were you in a separate canoe? Did you get out on a gravel bar and, you know, use your filming capacity?
Yeah, I was also in a canoe. So I have some behind the scenes stuff on YouTube, I think. It was crazy. So I had like a backpack that like a dry bag backpack, and I carried in it, when I went out in the canoe, I had a DSLR camera, a 7D, and then like a GoPro, and then my sound equipment in the backpack. I was wearing waders, so the same outfit that Doug or Stan, what they're wearing. So essentially what you would fly fish in. And then they each had a canoe for me. And so when I got those shots that they're just kind of very slow panning shots, what I would do is I would have my camera around my neck on a monopod so I could brace it and get a still shot. And I would just paddle a lot, put down my paddle, and then film and cruise. And sometimes it was difficult, like I couldn't do it because the currents were too strong, or I just had to do it really, really fast. And there were some days I went on some streams with Stan where it was too intense, like I couldn't really film while we were canoeing. And then there's the scene where in the beginning where Doug picks up his canoe and walks up that hill and you hear him huffing and puffing. And I had to do that too. But the canoes are massive, so I just had to like pull it up that hill. It was hard.
That's awesome. Well done. The music in the film really contributes to the mood and the impact. How did you coordinate the music?
Well, so while I was doing post-production of this film, I had a 2-year residency at the San Francisco Film Society. And what that was essentially an office space with about 30 other filmmakers, narrative and documentary. And it's a wonderful community. And I made friends with a narrative filmmaker. and he is a musician, and he's amazing, an amazing human. So he just offered to take a look at my rough cut, and I hadn't put in any music. I put in all the natural sound. That's kind of how I think about music in my mind, is I do all the sound design myself. But I guess because I come from a journalistic background, we are always taught not to use music, that music is a crutch. So my friend went in and chose temp music, and he just nailed it. Like, most of the songs in there he picked them. And then from there, I paired up with two composers in New York, upstate New York. And they were like, wow, this temp music is pretty much perfect. And they modified some of that. And then they also scored some other songs that just brought my film to the next level. So I give credit to my amazing friend, Dan Damon, and my composers.
What an amazing way to sort of bring the story of meeting people who put you up. I mean, you did an amazing sort of couch surfing trip, and then came back and connected with people who ended up just filling in the gaps that maybe you didn't know you had. That's the sense that I'm getting. A couple of quick questions about the footage. Somebody's curious how much footage you shot for this movie. And also, was there anything that you shot that ended up being cut that you wish you could have included? And I know from my own experience, when I go on adventures, there's always different tangents and threads, and it can be hard to sort of rein myself into the core story. What did you end up sort of setting aside, maybe for next time?
Yeah. Okay, so how much footage did I shoot? Oh gosh, I never tallied it up, because I was like, oh, what's the point? But a lot, maybe at least 100 hours, because a verite film. So verite is when you follow the action. My film isn't really interview based. Structurally, you end up shooting a lot. Like, you just don't know what's going to happen. I would mic up Doug and Stan first thing in the morning, all the way into the night, until I knew they were sick of it. And I was like, okay, we're done. So that was a lot of footage. Things that were cut, let's see. There's this one scene that I thought was so lovely, but I cut it from the beginning of the film. One morning, it was all foggy, misty, just had this eerie feeling. And Carol and Doug, they're at the front of the boat. Doug's driving, and they spot all these humpback whales, and Carol runs out in the back, and she's like, oh, there they are. And it was just such a beautiful moment for me, because they have lived out there for so long, and seeing wildlife is still so magical. I mean, it is magical seeing humpback whales. So I wish I could have kept that, but there just wasn't a good spot. This, with a lot of films, you have to cut so many gems. I also did do some interviews with, there were two people that Stan kind of bumps into on oh gosh, I don't even, maybe I did cut that, I forget now. But he bumps into these two people who are helping out with whale surveys, and they invited me to go and help them with some whale surveys, and I ended up not being able to. But they live in Hartley Bay, they're Gitgat, and they are just like really lovely people. And I interviewed them about their thoughts about what's going on. But I just had to kind of cut it, because it started to get a little off the spine of the film. I know there's so much going on there. I would have loved to film with the Guardian Watchman in Hartley Bay, which is an area where we were, but I just, there wasn't enough time and coordination to do it.
Right. I'm realizing as I'm listening to you tell this story, the behind the scenes information, that Stan and Doug probably spent more time with you socially than in the short time you were there than they did, with cumulatively with anyone else over the decades they've been there, just because of how remote that is. And I believe we need to be thinking about wrapping up. So looking towards the future, what's the next project that is on your mind? What would you like to do next?
Yeah, I have a few different ideas. I have my next film idea would be more expensive, so I'm not gonna just like go and backpack around. But I would like to do a film that takes place in South Africa about the origin of science through wildlife tracking. Some scientists believe that like wildlife tracking is the beginning of science in man, because you're making observations and then predictions off of those observations. And it's like Doug and Stan, kind of a dying knowledge that's not being passed down anymore. But there are some people who are trying to not just keep it alive, but also like spread this knowledge across the world. So that is my next project that I hope to make in the next few years.
That sounds incredible. I'll stay tuned, and I'm sure everybody who's watching will as well. I believe we're supposed to wrap up, so I want to thank the team, Cheryl and all the team at Cascadia International Women's Film Festival for bringing us together and for bringing your incredible film to this shareable platform. And also, Courtney, thanks to you. It's lovely to meet you. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to give us some of the behind the scenes experience. So thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
No right that you fought for can ever be assumed to stay with you for the rest of your life. You have to protect the rights that you've won.
If I'm going to die, I want to know what it is like to be free.